Hello, everybody. This is James Diboe, Golden, dedicated to original peoples, and we got a special guest on today, coming straight from Delaware, New England, over the East Coast, United States.
Yeah.
Kathryn Benjamin Golden. How are you doing, my sister?
Good. I'm doing well, my brother. How are you?
I'm great. Great to have you on, Professor.
Thank you.
Excellent. So
It's
today
great.
we're going to be speaking on a topic of the Maroons. And also, you can actually explain to me which part of the Maroons, because I understand they're not only in like Jamaica, they're in other places as well.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about your Africana studies and your
Okay.
connection with Professor Small.
Okay. Sounds good. Yes. Yeah, you're right. Maroons are you can argue worldwide as can be found across the diaspora, but certainly they are hemispheric and in the Atlantic world. But I am one of Professor Small's students. I he was my mentor. He is my mentor, my advisor at UC Berkeley and when I studied in the African Diaspora Studies program there, and I was studying the history of the African diaspora, specifically slave resistance studies, and really comparing the kinds of ways that people, African descendants, and African people have responded to the crisis of enslavement. And I went and moved toward the area of Virginia and North Carolina in my focus for thinking about United States instances of Maroons because they happened in the United States as well as in the jungles of Brazil and Amazonia, Palmares, Cuba. There are Maroon communities everywhere throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, but that does not exclude the United States, which actually is also Atlantic world facing and Caribbean world facing. And there's constant movement of people and ideas and these practices of resistance. So I was interested in this place known as now the Great Dismal Swamp because our ancestors gravitated toward places that Europeans found to be difficult and that they couldn't navigate or that were problem spaces for them from their perspectives. And when I say from their perspectives, that's usually means generated by greed or want to control land, but also people for labor and exploit and use. And so a swamp is not a place that people that have that mentality and have that objective want to be in, want to go through, want to navigate. It's a place that is actually found less in European climates. They're not used to these tropical spaces. And so it was a place in Virginia and in what becomes Virginia, what becomes North Carolina, that Europeans stayed out of. And so this made it an opportunist place for actually, first of all, Native peoples who are moving differently in the colonial moment than they were prior to European invasion, and actually are the first people to go into this swamp as and use it as a place of refuge from English colonization. But then later, as slave trade ramps up because of tobacco in Virginia, you have more and more African people that are moving through and staying in this place. So that's where I mean, this is what I wrote my dissertation about in large part, and now what I'm writing my book about as well. So yeah, that's how I began. That's my connection with Dr. Small and the UC Berkeley African Diaspora Studies program.
Great, great.
Yeah.
Well, interesting, Professor Small. He's a great professor,
Yep.
coming from Liverpool as well. So, it's great that he's made the connection as well. He's made some great connections for different professors from pretty much worldwide. So, I'm looking forward to this discussion today. Now, I know you said before about slave rebellions.
Yes.
So, that is always interesting to me as
Yeah,
well, because
yeah,
sometimes it's not a case of we were just enslaved, we let people do it, and we couldn't do nothing. So slave rebellion, if we could touch on this topic for a second, because it's
yeah,
very interesting to see that yes, we fought back and fighting for our freedom, and if you could tell us a little bit about some of the slave rebellions
yeah.
where the shoe is on
Well,
the other foot in some cases.
so there's a really strong connection between Maroons and outright revolution, and I'm thinking about Haiti when I say revolution, because this is considered a really successful, right, slave rebellion or mass effort to overthrow a slave holding regime. And we know that that happens. And there's Maroon involvement there. So there's, those of us who are studying histories of slave resistance, slave revolt, Marronage, there's usually always a Maroon dynamic to revolt. And that's because to plan and orchestrate and strategize a rebellion in the midst of a slaveholding, power, you have to move, you have to evade, you have to flee, you have to have independent space and time to think outside of you know the forced labor, the violence, the containment. And so you usually have people that are so-called runaways, right? So people who are sustaining life elsewhere, otherwise away. And I have found that to be also true in the context of the United States. But there are slave rebellions up and down the Americas that have always plagued this project or this attempt to enslave people with no problem. It's never been seamless. There's some scholars that have thought about this problem as a many-headed hydra, so a monster, if you will, from the colonial perspective, right? So a monster that they can't suppress. Like once you quell one, once you stop one conspiracy or rebellion, there's another one right behind it. So it's to speak to the indomitability of Black folks. It's to speak to you can't suppress human will. And so I was interested. So this dismal swamp that I talked about in Virginia and North Carolina, it was home to thousands, possibly and probably tens of thousands of Maroons across the span of time, ranging from roughly 1700 to 1865, so when the Civil War really ends. So within that span of almost 200 years, thereabout, we think that there was tens of thousands of people moving through or living permanently there. But the scholars that have written on it or thought about it, and really dug into the written records on people who are living there, and actually causing havoc in those towns and cities around this swamp. They weren't interested solely within their focus on the kinds of force or the kinds of really it's counter violence, it's defensive violence, protective violence that these Maroons were using as a way of life, as a way of survival there. And so one of the first things I published on this was about violent resistance, but organized resistance by using the swamp space itself, so the natural refuge, to hide those plans, but also to sustain this kind of alternative life there, which is a rebellion itself. But they were involved in more forms of rebellion that are closer more to, I think, what you're asking me about, which is, we are fighting the powers that be. We have rebels on the ground. We're in actual combat, and that happens in the Great Dismal Swamp. And particularly when there's war, particularly when war that's not the war of slavery, but war that's when white folks are at war with each other, or when there's some kind of chaos that colonists are facing. So the Revolutionary War, for example, and then later the War of 1812. And I'm sorry, I recognize you're in England, so the Revolutionary War, we don't necessarily say that. Right? But
I recognize it though. I
you know what
recognize
I'm.
it.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay.
It's about,
But
I've done a lot of research on Black history, African history, so I'm very familiar with how they
Yes.
speak in America or wherever in the
Okay.
world.
Okay.
I'm open to
Very,
it.
yes. Okay. So when those moments happen, they are also opportunities for those who are already in like flux or in resistance to heighten that. And so really 1792, when that war is happening, up until, the 1810s, 1820s. Um, Not so much the 1830s because of Nat Turner's rebellion. So after that, which happens in 1831, not far from this swamp in Southampton County, Virginia, um, there's a doubling down, a tripling down of like vigilant scouring of this swamp because slaveholders believe that people involved in that rebellion were plotting with Maroons in the local swamps, but also planning to escape as a course of action after the rebellion, to either further it or to hide themselves and move elsewhere. But so there was a effort to find all of these insurgents in the swamp, and that didn't turn out. It didn't turn out that they found many people who were involved in Nat Turner's rebellion. There was at least one or two cases, though, where there was a positive, thought to be an accused or suspected connection there. But
Great
but
name,
yeah,
Nat
so
Turner. Great man. Nat
yeah,
Turner.
so there's Virginia has tremendous history. I mean, there's Gabriel Prosser as well, who also was responsible for or thought to be responsible for the leadership. And he certainly he had a lot to do with that. But it was an entire community of people who wanted to take the city of Richmond, Virginia, and overthrow slavery in 1800. And that also has a connection with the Great Dismal Swamp, in that a year later, there is another attempt when Prosser's rebellion was foiled, it was given up, it was betrayed. Um, some of his followers tried again a year later. And that rebellion, called the Easter Conspiracy, it begins to involve people in the Dismal Swamp, and noted Maroons. And so in this rebellion of 1801, 1802, people are hiding guns on the swamp. They made their own swords. They hid them in the swamp. They had ammunition they stole. They hid it in the swamp. And these are all in trial records but these connections haven't really been made very explicitly between Maroons in the swamp and constant Black mobility and these other rebellions that are quite famous in the United States, like Gabriel Prosser's rebellion is pretty well known. Nat Turner, everybody knows. But there are these connections. So I like the question about revolt. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So a very interesting one, like you say, a successful revolution, Haiti. You
Hmm.
know, have you got any information on Haiti, for example? Because most people think, how was they able to overcome? Because it wasn't just only the French, it was also other countries that are involved as well that are oppressing the Haitians. Like, how were they able to defeat all these forces?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
some people say,
yeah.
for example, they were dealing with because they keep their African spirituality intact as well, what they call
Well, that's,
Vodun
I
and
mean,
stuff, you know.
so you are getting to something really, really important. I think it's no coincidence that when you have a colony, as it was, the crown jewel of the French, colonial empire, France was getting rich. I mean, buku rich, because of enslaved labor in Haiti, their prized possession for sugar. But because of that, and they continue to import African captives to the point that I think you had a situation, I want to say was something like 200,000 African people, including African descendants. So people born in Africa, but also African descendants born there, or born elsewhere in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic world, to like 40,000, I think it's 40,000 European people living there. So you're severely outnumbered. And so those conditions demographically are gonna be, they're gonna aid any massive rebellion. But you're right, the spiritual component, but it's not just spiritual. I mean, it's just language as well. But certainly and just larger culture, having so many people as well. There's more people born in Africa in Haiti during this time than born in the Americas. So that also, suggests that there's that intactness or
Yeah.
that very strong memory of and understanding of self that is not creolized, which I do think also helps to motivate mass movements. And the first instance of rebellion in the Haitian Revolution is the ceremony that happens at Boy Cayman, and led by, Bookman Duddy, and there's women there. Cecile Fatsuman is there as well. So there's this book that I recommend to all your listeners, Rituals and Runaways. And it's written by someone named Crystal Edens. And she just goes into how, voodoo and spirituality, so West African spirituality, of really the Yoruba, so people living in what is now Nigeria, but also other peoples as well who are coming in, with groupings of them, of their ethnic backgrounds, really aided in this rebellion. But she's talking about ritual, but also how a history of flight, a history of fugitivity there also has assisted. So she talks about in names that maroon dynamic that I mentioned as aiding this rebellion. But it's these factors, but it's also I think it's mainly these factors, right? But it's also a kind of geographical or spatial thinking about it as well. So there's mountains that people were, that ceremony that I mentioned, a lot of the planning that is going on there is happening in far remote places around the mountain ranges there that start to get closer to the Spanish border, where what is now the Dominican Republic is. And that
Yeah.
also, assisted in some of the planning that went into the strategy behind this. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's some of those conditions, most of those conditions never happened in the United States.
Yeah.
You have, yeah, we're enslaved people in British North America were severely outnumbered in basically all times, with a few exceptions in a few times, namely South Carolina, in Charleston, the Charleston area. But for the most part, in most places, as slavery develops, you have small plantations in the United States. I'm talking less than 20 people in a farm. Those plantations, like what you would see and what you do see in the Caribbean and Latin America, with hundreds of people enslaved in one place, in one, plantation. That's not with deep personalized relationships between the master, so-called, and enslaved people. You don't know your enslaver, or your enslaver is still in England, or Amsterdam, or wherever it is. Those kinds of relationships didn't happen as much in the United States. And so you had really close, intimate relationships between enslavers and the enslaved. You're highly monitored, surveilled, highly repressive. And this isn't to say that it's not highly repressive in the Caribbean, but it's just a different circumstance or condition of enslavement, of bondage. And so people responded differently. And so it's still, I think, important, to your larger point about resistance and revolt, to call out and pay attention to the smaller scale forms of revolt that happened in the United States, or the ones that failed, that weren't as successful, that because they are attempts, and they do indicate, and they are, evidence of this greater tradition of Black radicalism and humanism, and resistance and planning, and creation of whole other worlds when they're only supposed to be property, right? So
Yeah.
so yeah, I hope I
So
have
it was
gone.
slightly different than the United States compared to other places like in the Caribbean or South America. Now, a place very interesting you mentioned before, Cuba. Cuba is a very interesting one.
Yeah.
If you could tell us a little bit about Cuba during the time of
Mhm.
rebellions, the Maroons, because the
Okay.
Maroons are everywhere, like you said, isn't it?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Cuba, Cuba has, Cuba has an interesting history. So I teach a class on Atlantic world, so Maroons in the Atlantic world, and I teach um, a narrative that was orally delivered by a man named Esteban Montejo, who was a Cuban Maroon, and he writes of other Maroons in Cuba. This is the only, I guess, if you will, yeah, if you will, first person account of being, the experience of being a Maroon, and it takes place in Cuba. He was a young man when he first flees a sugar plantation there, and it was sugar and coffee to some extent. But he flees from sugar labor and the violences he saw there, and was a solitary Maroon in Cuba. So he lived until slavery starts to Cuba enters into war and slavery starts to subside there, as a Maroon, and he's living in I don't think you can call them rainforests, but they are certainly tropical forests.
Yeah, yeah,
And he talks about survival by theft. He talks about living in caves. He talks about seeing other smaller groups of Maroons. The Maroons that I am aware of in Cuba were not large, huge groups, but smaller groups. And I think that again speaks to possibly the terrain. So it being a confined, smaller island.
yeah.
Um,
The
yeah.
reason
So
why I'm mentioning Cuba as well because of the same with like Haiti, the African
mhm.
spirituality intact. They have Santeria or
Yes.
from the
Yeah.
Yoruba. So
Yes.
I just thought that was interesting,
Oh,
like keeping the African connections intact. So
yeah.
it'd probably give them that like unity more. You'd be able to
Mhm.
unify a lot more.
It's interesting. He mentions in his account more about the barracoons, so the barracks, which are basically slave quarters. And when he's thinking about spirituality, he is talking about how those ideas about conjure, um, which really mean, I mean, this is Ifa. This is
Yeah.
an African religious system of ritual and belief and ancestry, spirituality, but and divination, but it really means seeing in nature. And he talks a lot about how trees and animals and wildlife strengthened him, enabled him to be able to achieve this as a teenager and a young man in your 20s alone in when slavery's going on, moving through different places and swamps and forests. He talked about the life forces of these places, but he brought that. I mean, he learned that from the Barracoons and from elders around that were saying these things and the rituals he witnessed. Um, and but he doesn't identify as the Congo, so he'll talk about the Kakongo that are there, and then he'll talk about some of the Yoruba folks that are there too. So he understands the different African backgrounds that he saw in the slave quarters and distinguishes between their practices and their beliefs. It's a really interesting read, but I know that that's just one example. I mean, it's just one
Yeah.
Maroon. But as for the broader, Maroons that are in Cuba, not a lot that I can give you right now.
Yeah.
They're hunting with dogs. I mean, the Cuban bloodhounds. They're so the this is a breed of dogs, right? That is known to be a product of what the Spanish did in Cuba to subdue fugitive slaves in Cuba. There's writings on that, about trying to hunt some of these places for Maroons, essentially in Cuba. But they seem to be more isolated cases than what you would see in Jamaica or in Suriname. I mean, huge states and really sovereignties of Maroons, hundreds of people living in. Didn't happen so much in Cuba.
Was there any of this in Trinidad Island? Trinidad. Was there any Maroons in Trinidad or didn't they reach that far?
I'm certain. I mean, I'm certain,
Mm,
and I wish I can point to the primary source record about
yeah.
it. But I know that if you looked in their colonial records,
Yeah.
Trinidad and Tobago, you're gonna see. you're going to find these cases that you either have to then identify as Maroons because you know what Marronage is, or you know what this practice of cimarronaje is, which is flight, but also establishing another whole community or another way of life against what you're told you're supposed to do. And there's a whole, again, regime that's saying you have to be in this place, laboring in these ways, um, and being commodified in these ways. I'm sure that when you apply that definition, you're going to see instances of that there. And that's
Yeah,
why we've said that it's everywhere. I mean, it even took place along the well, along the west and west central coasts of Africa, where people are being imported as enslaved captives to then embark upon the Middle Passage and the transatlantic trade. So there's some cases of people um, being, they're led in these coffles to these slave dungeons along the coast of Africa, who are then fleeing from there and going into places that they are either familiar with or that they can see and they've studied in their travels to the coasts from the hinterland. Okay, there's a river there. There's a place that we couldn't be seen. And other scholars have found cases of Maranash happening there in that way. So it's innate.
yeah, interesting. So when you first started getting into your studies of with Professor Small, how did it all begin for you? Did you have like a thirst for African history, Black history, or like what was it like growing up for you?
Yeah.
Was the Did you get your information later on in life, or did you have an interest from young? How did it all come to you to get into the line of work that you're in now?
Yeah. Well, I would say that you might consider it happening early for me, that my consciousness was awakened by my own elders
Great.
and a few of them, two of them, two of them who studied in the 1990s. They were studying on their own, and they were people in their 30s and 40s at that time, studying on their own, our own people and our own origins, and beyond, and histories that were beyond slavery, beyond suffering. And so I think I chose to go back to slavery. So that they were thinking, they wanted us to think about, and they were reading, Cheikh Anta Diop and Molefi Asante and Browder and folks that are thinking about African origins and African civilizations and
Yeah, great.
our roots that go beyond the routes of slavery and slave trade and
Who we
colonization.
are. Yeah,
You're right. And so that's how I began to realize there are whole worlds that and knowledges and ways of thinking that there's also a lot of effort to suppress or not teach in our schools. I certainly wasn't hearing that at the schools I was going to. So um, suppressed knowledge or knowledge that seems to be threatening to the status quo, I'm really piqued by. And I always have been. And I have always had a really strong sense of justice. And so I, and I believe in a relationship between knowledge and justice and change. And so I began to think about, well, how can I flip, like what hasn't been told about the painful and difficult stories of slavery and enslavement? What things haven't been or have been suppressed there? Are there stories of victory, or where we're victors? Are there stories of pleasure? And what can we learn then from these stories? Um, because I believe also as a historian, a social historian, that everything about the past is a lesson. So
definitely.
it's something that we need in order to move to futures that we want to be in more.
Yeah,
And so returning to them has been important to me. And that's really it. The two people I talked about, one is my uncle, one is my dad.
yeah. Great
So
inspiration. Great.
yeah.
I mean, I was fortunate to be told like from your father because we are Nigerian. So we kind of already had the history of like, well, this is where you're from. This is geographical area in Nigeria, Delta State. This is the tribe. This is the village. And so I was fortunate to have that from young. So it got me very
Wow.
interested in wanting to know more about my history as I got older. You know,
Yes.
like you said before, people like Anthony Browder, Sheikh Anta Diop, a great mentor of mine, Dr. Runoko Rashidi.
Oh,
Um,
wonderful. Oh,
very,
wow.
I got to meet him and put his, I've interviewed him before he passed away, and I brought him. He
Okay.
came to Liverpool. I put on an event for him, so he was
Yeah.
like a great
Yeah.
mentor to the global African presence. So then I started traveling
That's
myself
amazing.
and connecting with different Black people from around the world.
Yeah.
So it's very
Yes.
important to, there's so many different parts of our history, like there's the
Hmm.
beginning where everyone from Africa, then you got the part with the civilizations, not just only Kemet from all over Africa. And
Hmm.
then you'd have a part where we're captured into slavery.
Right.
And I'm
Right.
telling it the way Renaud Rashidi explained it. The three phases of African history: uh, birthplace of humanity, then the civilizations, then we're captured and enslaved. So those three periods are very important to have a basic understanding of, just to show people like, because some people like, I mean, people I went to school with or people I grew up with, they didn't have this type of knowledge. They were just thought, well, we were captured into slavery and that was
Right.
it.
Right.
So it's very
Right.
important that we understand, get a basic understanding of different parts of
Hmm.
Africa, different things going on. But it's
Hmm.
great that you have the consciousness from young, because not everybody has that.
Well,
And
some of
then,
those things. So
yeah,
My dad brought me to see Runoko Rashidi when he came to Richmond, California one time. It was he was talking about the African presence and roots in, I think, Southeast Asia and
yeah,
even Australia. So yeah, it was I think I might have been 10 when I heard that. So
yeah.
yeah, I love how
I
you
was I was very surprised, and then when I decided to go into these Southeast Asian countries, and I had to go into the rainforest to see these Black people, very African looking as well, look no different than an African tribe, a lot of them. So it shows you like a history of the beginning African people, and people thought a lot of people like don't look like this in these types of countries,
right,
but through deep
right.
research and visiting the most secluded places in these countries, you
Hmm.
get to see the people, and it's basically like ancient people. They still live,
Right.
they still live like in ancient times, in tune with nature more, and it's very similar spirituality to Africa.
Yes.
That's what I found with them, and many places in the world as well. So
Right.
that's why he's probably my greatest mentor. So
Wow.
big up
Well,
Renault
what an honor
Rashidi,
to have. Yeah, what a great honor to be mentored by Renuka Rashidi.
definitely. So anyway, so you got to there see Renault Rashidi yourself. You said in Richmond, California.
Yes, he came
And
to a community
and
center.
you're only 10 years of age.
I believe so. I may have been
Wow,
11 or 12, but
that must
yes,
be an experience.
yeah, it was. It was.
Yeah.
But those are the kinds of things that I I'm also honored that, those my parents and others were intentional about, because as you've said, in our schools, this is a parallel probably almost everywhere, um, at least in the global north, where these things are not taught in a school setting, and that trickles into other arenas of life, your family life, your personal life, within your home, I mean. Um, so yeah, and there's even more of a kind of war against learning about histories that are not uh, traditional or dominant focused histories, in the United States in particular, with laws right now being proposed, passed, with a rapid nature now, to stop teaching even slavery. I mean, and I know we're talking about millennia of history, you and I, but even just the history of slavery from perspectives that are Black or are the people who were subjugated,
So
and
sorry.
continue to be.
So you're
Yeah.
saying that in the schools they're trying to
Mhm.
stop teaching Black history. Is this
Yes.
like going to be the plan on to do it all over America, or does it start in particular states or?
So there are laws now being proposed in states like Texas and Florida, but other states as well. I don't want to misspeak, but I know there are some states mainly focused in the middle of our country, where there's efforts to suppress what could be taught or dictate or only cover certain areas of the long history of colonization and slavery. And these are anti-woke acts. That's what they've been called. Woke as in you are conscious or aware, or you want to be, or you can be, or it is going to be made as if you can get to a place of consciousness where you understand more than a traditional history or historical narration of any given events within our history. But there has recently been those to curtail what could be said about slavery. The word enslaved, I mean, versus the word slave, these things are being pushed back against. So, and this is the remnants of Trump America, and to say the least, right?
Yeah.
But
Funny enough, you mentioned about Florida. I did
yeah.
read a headline one time that because they're stopping it in Florida, I was concentrating on Florida. I seen black churches. He was like an article saying that they have started teaching black history in the churches.
Hmm.
Now, I looked at that two ways. One, great, teach it by any means, doesn't matter if it's in the church, doesn't matter where it is.
Hmm.
So, but then I looked at, is it trying to get people into the church or like Christianize people, or is it basically,
Hmm.
it's a rebellion against not wanting to teach Black history. So if you got to do it in the church, do it in the
Right.
church.
Well, the church has a history of itself being a political platform for Black uplift in the
Yeah,
United States. Um, I mean, this has been a politicized space where we have, taught each other our own histories in a way that we've had to disguise at times in terms of the so-called Negro spirituals we've sang with hidden meanings embedded. That's a form of teaching against what we're supposed to not be teaching one another about our desires or what our next movements are or where we've been. Um, then you think about the 20th century and you think about the civil rights movement and all of the churches that were mobilizing people in efforts of mass movements
yeah,
within that time. So I think there's a larger history of that. And I'm not surprised to hear that that's happening again because and there are other movements as well. There's other efforts taking place in those places in universities and in schools themselves where the actual teachers don't want to adhere to some of these new laws being proposed and now being passed.
well, it's
So
good. It's good to rebel anyway. Yeah, very interesting. It's very important, that we can keep this push on teaching Black history, African history. It's very important because as they're trying to stop it, break it down, and keep us in this brainwash mentality.
mm,
I think we're facing greater challenges now, and we're facing great challenges also, as in more people have the opportunity and the access to find this knowledge. We've got internet now. It's a lot more easier than it was for our parents or
sure.
people before
Yeah.
that. So, what's some
Even,
solutions you think?
social media as well. It has
Yeah,
been, I mean, it's dangerous though in some ways in that how valid is the information we're getting? We always have to think about. Um,
yeah,
but is this a real source? But we have Black Twitter, we have Black presences. I mean, this is diaspora in digital spaces of exchange and communication with one another right now, where we can pass information, pass news, pass images that we're taking ourselves of what's going on in our communities as well as other links to other sources. So I think it's an unprecedented time in that respect. Um, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and then that can be used and against some of the constant onslaught that we really faced historically. where there has been an effort to suppress or to withhold or to remove us from, our own worlds and our own histories.
Well, there's always been a lot of whitewashing, doesn't matter if it was Egypt or, even the fact of basically saying that Africa had no civilization, and another thing, they take Egypt out of Africa, like it's not a part of Africa,
Yes. Yeah.
so there's many things, but as adults, people have to start taking this serious because we do have a handful of our people who are not too interested in our history. So now I know that's down to the colonial mentality, slavery, and also people told that Africa weren't nothing great, people being even anti-African, not proud to be African.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
there needs to be like a push for the adults to be able to come together as a community
Hmm.
and push for, doesn't matter if it's Saturday schools, evening classes,
Hmm.
so this is why I do the Zooms, the podcast, to try to connect with different people, wherever we
Yeah.
are in the world, and
Yeah.
push this information out. And in the city I'm from, there's not a whole lot of people involved in Black history. There's a small portion of people. So it's very important to connect. We've got the internet now, we can like Zooms, we can speak
Yeah.
to each other, whatever. So it's about
Yeah.
making this connection globally, how you feel about that?
I think that's exactly right. And I will do what I can to help make spread what you're doing here with my folks in my communities who are interested and who need to be interested, as you've pointed out. And I also just would say part of why I also go to this place in the papers that are 200, 300 years old that I read in the places themselves, where not only were they places of bloodshed and suffering, but they are places of tremendous pride. And that's personal for me, but I think that the work I'm doing, I'm also intentionally um, exposing the great lengths and risks and dangers that people took in this moment of peril as a point to say, in this moment of peril, which is 2024, and this is a new kind of peril. This is, the aftermath or the afterlife of the things that I'm writing about, in the 1800s. But strength can be derived from that because it does show, what could be done in that moment, and then how can that be applied to this one for new movements, and let's continue to be fugitives as we face the world that we're in. As you've said earlier, how can we fight against some of those efforts to suppress our education now in our various places that we're in? But that's just one example. So I think that there's many ways, and we have talked about nature here as well, and the more harmonious or the more complementary or collaboratory ways that African people and Indigenous people more broadly relate to nature. And we're facing global climate crisis right now, and it's really less our doing
Yeah.
than it is other folks, and yet our communities suffer the most. But the lessons of the Maroons and other Indigenous communities who have lived more balanced ways with the natural world, or in those moments of colonization when they're thrust in the natural world as objects of labor and exploit, and the natural world is thought of that way as well. We have still tried to oppose that, or learn about plant life, or use the very last bone of an animal, right, in order to sustain our lives and our social communities, our socialities themselves. When again, we're told that those don't matter, and we are only to be in the service of capitalism, or in and however that looks, whatever specific system or specific place and time that looks like. And for me, of course, I'm talking about racial capitalism, but or and
Interesting.
racialized slavery. So yeah, I think those are lessons, and I hope that inspires continued future furthered movement. That's
Yeah.
what it's
Well,
about.
today, we've come on the show for me, I'm over in the UK, you're over in the States, and be able to come together. And this is what it's about, wherever we are in the world, Black unity, African unity.
Mhm.
And, I want to give you a big thanks anyway, Professor Kathryn Benjamin Golden.
Thank you. I really appreciate meeting you and talking with you, and I hope to stay connected with you as you continue what you're doing too.
Definitely. Well, this is James Diboe and Discovered, dedicated to original peoples as always. And big thanks anyway. And I know you got a busy day ahead of you, so we'll be in touch, and hopefully we can
Okay,
continue the mission because it
absolutely.
don't stop.
Okay. Well, in solidarity, thank you, James.
Peace
All
anyway.
right.
Thank you very much, and you have a
All
great
right.
evening.
All
Thank
right.
you.
You too.
Bye bye.
Peace.